Y'all may be seated. Morning, saints. Morning, sinners. Let's stop just for a moment. Carol Ann and David, we've been praying for Andrew Howerton for quite a while. He's a captain in the United States Army. He's been serving a long deployment away from home, and he got home safely yesterday with his family. And we want to celebrate that, right? Beautiful little daughter, Aiden. She was 1 month old when he had to leave, and it's been gone for a while. And so now we're praying that they just have a lot of fun together as a family, and we're very thankful that they are together. And we hope to see him soon. Hug his neck and all that fun stuff. Yeah, exactly. All right. Let me continue on. Today is a day of celebration, a day of remembrance, a day of dwelling in God's presence together as we commemorate the day of All Saints Sunday. It's a day to remember our loved ones from our lives who have died in our faith. We honor their memory, we name their names, and we celebrate their life with God while we still grieve their physical absence from our lives. Because of the hope of the resurrection, we claim that there will be a day when God will reunite us all together in love, where we will be one happy family together. Becoming a saint starts for us at baptism. In the waters of grace, we are made new. The old creation is washed away, and the new creation is established through the power of the Holy Spirit. And the claim of the church in baptism is this: every breath you breathe after your baptism is an eternal breath, because we are grounded in the resurrection of Jesus through our baptisms, which means you will never die. You will never die. I experienced this in a really fun way just a couple of months ago when Pastor Kate washed Sophie's forehead in the waters of grace and then gave her back to us. And I looked at her and I thought, there is a moment where she will never not live, because God's grace is that powerful. There is a moment where she will never not live now because of the power of God's grace through our baptisms. It means that God is stronger than anything in this world that would try to separate us. And our scriptures this morning from Isaiah and Revelation and John showcase how God will wipe away every tear, remove every fear, and destroy the shroud of death that death tries to cast over God's people. Now, we still continue to sin on this side of eternity. But God overlooks our sin and sees what we will become in the power of his grace. God sees us as saints, the brothers and sisters of Jesus. Becoming a saint continues in worship. We gather here to hear the word of forgiveness proclaimed in our lives. We hear God's word, which challenges us and frees us and sends us back into the world to share the good news that it brings us. We gather around God's table to be nourished with grace and be filled with the hope of our salvation. And this weekly gathering and eating turns us into the ones who love God and love our neighbors. Being one of God's saints, however, doesn't mean that we are immune from the hardships of life. And the story we hear of Lazarus today is a story about the best friends of Jesus. Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha would offer their home to the disciples to stay and work from while Jesus was in Bethany. He ate there and he spent a lot of good time with his friends there. But being one of the best friends of Jesus doesn't save Lazarus from getting sick and dying. Jesus shows up a little late to Lazarus' funeral, and he's called out by Mary. He weeps over her grief and the death of his best friend. But then he does the impossible, and he raises Lazarus from his 4-day-old tomb. And as Lazarus comes out, Jesus says, "Unbind him and let him go." There are many things in our life that bind us. Death is the biggest, but there are other things that lock us down too. Our own mistakes, fear, anxiety, shame, guilt, despair, sadness. We feel them all. And when they come over us, we can feel like Lazarus, wrapped up and stuck in a tomb with no particular way out. But we see from the beginning to the end of every single gospel story about Jesus that his mission of grace, his activity in life is about unbinding us from all that traps us so that we can go and live life abundantly. And I want to invite Steve Bargmann forward to come up here and share with us a recent story of his of being bound in a sickness that he ignored for far too long until it caught up with him, and his story of Jesus unbinding him and letting him go. So church, help me welcome Steve this morning. Yep.
Good morning. As Paul said, my name is Steve Bargmann. I have been a member of this church since 1994, 24 years now. I've also been a Stephen minister for about 12 or 13 years. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of people through that time, to share, to walk with them, to go through life with them. Why am I up here? This is a service of healing and remembrance. And I'm the best example, I guess, from our Stephen ministry team right now of someone that experienced that healing. I had open heart surgery on June 18th. And so I'm 4 months out or so from recovery. If I'd been paying attention prior to that time, I had several signs. I like to ride my bike on the hike and bike trail over here to the west. And several times I was out on the bike, and when I stopped for a little bit of rest, I would feel a little bit faint. A couple times I even fell down, skinned my knees, skinned my shins. But I didn't think anything about it. I can bounce back and recover. One of those rides, I got home. I live in a second-story apartment, and I couldn't make it up the steps. My neighbors came out checking on me, a couple of them, worried about my situation. But I said I can manage. I, again, didn't pay attention. On May 31st, rather than riding my bike, I went out for an early morning walk. I normally would walk 30, 40 minutes. That morning, I made it about 20 minutes, and I started having difficulty breathing, difficulty keeping my pace up. I walked for around 20 minutes, returned to the apartment. I sat down at my table, and the room started spinning. I thought it would be something that I could pass quickly. I leaned over, held my head for a bit, and the next thing I knew, I was laying on the floor with the table legs next to my back, and I was looking at the legs of my chairs. I'd passed out. I dropped to the floor. That's very frightening if you're someone living by yourself. But I told no one. This was a Thursday morning. I went through the weekend trying to figure out, what had happened, but I didn't tell anybody. And it wasn't until I went to the men's Bible study here on Monday morning, started talking to a couple people, and they were encouraging me to talk to a doctor. I was able to see my first doctor on June 11th on Monday, and he right away scheduled me for a nuclear stress test on Wednesday the 13th. Stress tests has never bothered me. I can ramp them up, increase the incline, increase the speed, and just keep going, usually 12 or 13 minutes. This morning, when I got to the 8-minute mark, I told them they better be shutting it down. I'd had enough. My heart rate was near 131 beats a minute, which was my target rate. And when I sat back on the table or the gurney next to the treadmill, my heart dropped to about 35 beats a minute. That's not sustainable. That caused some alarms to go off, caused some people, the technicians called for the doctor. The doctor, the first thing she did is call for the crash cart with the paddles and the adrenaline shots and the things like that they're going to use to get you going again. I didn't need all that at that time, but they did tell me that I needed to go to Baylor to have additional tests. And I told them no problem. I can drive. I'm perfectly capable. Their comment was to laugh. I looked over the shoulder of the doctor, and I saw 8 of Plano's finest. 4 a.m. EMT technicians and 4 people from the fire and rescue squad. If the doctor wasn't going to convince me that I couldn't drive, 8 of them were going to definitely tell me I wasn't going to drive. I was taken to Baylor and spent the day in test, was told I'd have a procedure later that day. Well, maybe on Thursday. Well, then it moved to Friday. Finally, they identified that one of the medications that I had been taking caused them to move it all the way to Monday. I was taken into surgery about 2 o'clock on Monday. I ended up having to have an aortic valve replacement and a bypass. I got back to my room, or what I remember being in my room, about 9 o'clock. What I was told is that when they brought me out, they recognized right away that I had an arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat. So once they started bringing me out of anesthesia, they had to put me back under and then bring the paddles in, shock me back into a normal rhythm, and then bring me out again. The nurses were in all through the evening, and then the next morning they let me rest a little bit, but they started me at 4 a.m. Blood work, testing, rehab was in to get me up already by 7 to get me up and walking. I spent 4 days in the hospital before I was released. That was when I saw the blessings of being part of this church family really start. Those 4 days. I had numerous visitors, numerous people showing up to check on my well-being, to let me know that I was in their prayers. I started receiving get well cards from people. A lot of you were showing me a level of support that I was not expecting. After the hospital, that caring continued. Joe and Carol McGrain opened their home to me. As I said, I was in a second-story apartment. I could not walk up 16 steps to get to my apartment. Joe and Carol opened their house, let me stay there for just over 3 weeks. What it amounted to, though, is that they opened their home, but the rest of you responded. A list was prepared, and every night our meals were prepared by somebody from this congregation. We could look at the list, we could see who was preparing the meal and what it was that we were going to have for that evening. That was the best part about looking forward to what was coming. In addition to that, I continued to receive cards. I received probably almost 80 cards while I was down. So many of you took the opportunity to put a card in the mail and let me know that you were thinking about me and that I was in your prayers. It's very difficult for me to accept help. But I know from being a Stephen minister that that's one of the things we have to do. Learn to ask, learn to accept help from other people. It was especially difficult for me to go to Joe and Carol's home, to accept that there was care from another source, that I didn't have to do it by myself. But the chaplain in the hospital came in and we were talking about it, and he said it's a God thing. He says people are responding to a message that they hear to help, to reach out and do something, to respond. Don't stand in their way. Don't stop them from responding. I think that's what we do as Stephen ministers. We respond to the call of others. We can only do that, though, if you allow us to respond, if you allow us to know that you need the help. As a Stephen minister, we are trained in caregiving. We receive 50 hours of training before we're commissioned. Then in addition, we have continuing ed through our meetings every month. Our care is based on strict confidentiality. That means that as a Stephen minister, I cannot confirm to anyone that I'm seeing you as a care receiver. You can tell people, but even if you tell somebody, I can't confirm or deny it. Confidentiality is the most important thing that we stress. Some people will ask what it means or who can receive care as a care receiver. You will have the opportunity to go through to some blessing stations at the back, and those cards show what type of information is on there. It identifies people that are going through a grief experience. This can be the loss of a family member or a friend. It can be illness, divorce, unemployment, relocation, anything that really throws you off of your normal routine. Gives you an opportunity to let you know that there can be somebody there to walk with you to share that experience. We are objective, non-judgmental listeners. What have I learned from my experience? Pay attention. I think that's the thing. Like I said, I was given several opportunities, several signs that told me that I was having difficulty, and I kept ignoring them until it got severe enough that I had to do something. Secondly, healing is a process. It's not going to happen overnight. I'm going through rehab right now. I have about another week in the scheduled program that I have, but it's something that I have to keep going, keep working on. I've been told that it will be most of a year before I'm back to really feeling normal again, however you want to describe that. Third, God provides support to us in many different ways. I had support from doctors and nurses, very special people at Baylor, friends, family, and especially this church family. All of you that stepped forward to let me know that you were thinking about me, praying for me, was wonderful. And cards are an easy way to let people know that you're thinking about them. I've never been one much to send them, to get them out, to address them, to send them to people. But I can tell you that it meant something to me to receive them from all of you and have that experience to let you know that you were thinking about me. The Stephen ministers have hosted this service of remembrance for several years. Most of the time we've done it in a small situation where we invited the people that we knew had lost a loved one or a family member, a friend. We knew that from the bulletin. We checked that every week. We would invite a small group together and we would have this on a much smaller scale. This is the first year we've tried doing it for the church as a whole. And the idea is that there are losses that you've experienced, sadness, different things that you've experienced in your life that we may not be aware of. By doing it for the whole church, this is our way of spreading that healing, spreading that opportunity to share to the whole congregation. Thank you.
When they are removed off of our prayer list because they got better. That's always a good sign towards health and healing. So, Steve, thank you for sharing your story. Jesus is often well known for the message that he preached and the activity he was up to, especially his sacrifice for us on the cross. One of the things we tend not to emphasize often enough is the healing ministry that he provided for people. Folks would line up side of whatever house that he was in for dozens and dozens of people. They would even tear off the roof so they could bring their friends to experience healing from him. And since he is now up in heaven and reigning over earth from there, he charges the church with that similar approach to ministry. And the call is to each of us. Unbind them and let them go. And Steve was able to experience that unbinding in his life so that he could get back to ministering and enjoying the life that God has set up for him. Later on in worship, we're going to have opportunities for communion, lighting candles in memory of loved ones in your life, and also to receive the experience of an anointing of grace through the oil that is shared with us in the prayers of the Stephen ministers. They are participating in a centuries-old tradition where we're encouraged to call on other members of the church to pray over us and to anoint us and remind us of how God unbinds us from whatever we might be trapped in, whatever might be locking us, whatever might be binding us in life. And so we'll pray that God's presence joins us for each of those moments. Steve, thank you again for sharing. Let's continue.